There is online a recording, I think, is it 3 hours or more than 3 hours of me talking about this, broken up into bits. So clearly what I'm going to say in this session is not everything by any means that could be said. There's always a risk when you compress that something doesn't come across clearly or isn't balanced. So hopefully I'll stay clear of that. But I think all of us can probably acknowledge that this issue of gender identity and of sexuality is never far from the headlines. Just some headlines, of course, the Olympics was perhaps one of the most recent ones, but lots of headlines affecting lots of spheres of life, including education, healthcare, sports, and society generally as well, as to where people stand on this. And I think we're probably aware that the whole question of how society deals with the question of gender identity is far from settled, whereas questions about sexuality for the wider society and for the law are really quite clearly settled for now, at least in terms of acceptance of same-sex relationships, but there's still quite a degree of debate around gender identity. And I think we need to realise, therefore, that there are a couple of shifts, or there has been a shift, which is more or less completed. There is another shift which is still happening, but is not yet settled. But if we start with what most people prior to, really prior to this millennium, and certainly prior to the middle half of the 20th century, would have thought about these issues, there was a general understanding that there are two sexes, male and female, that there are gender identities, man and woman, that go with those sexes, and gender expression should broadly align with that as masculine or feminine, and that men should be attracted to females and women to men, okay, and that idea that there are sort of two normal lines, if you like, and that it's normal when these things line up in all of those boxes. But of course, there are folks, and I think we can say that there always have been, or certainly for a very long time, have been folks who don't fit neatly into those boxes, which is where the third line comes along. So there are situations where biological sex is not just as clear-cut as that, but those would have been understood and still are in medical terminology as disorders of sex development, in the same way that development can go wrong in any part of your body. That can happen with the sexual organs. With gender identity, that if people didn't, if they felt themselves to be in the wrong body, that would have been seen as a psychological disorder. That's no longer the case in medical diagnostic criteria, but that would have been the case. That folks who cross-dressed were being rebellious or provocative or pushing boundaries. And of course that same-sex attraction was either described as unnatural, well, broadly described as unnatural, but when it comes to same-sex activity, that would have been either described as unnatural or sinful, depending on whether you were thinking in religious terms. You would have thought sinful. If you were thinking in non-religious terms, people still broadly took the same view and would have seen that as unnatural. Because there was an idea that what morality is something that is governed by the nature of things. So if we take God out of the equation, we should still go by what is natural. So people like Immanuel Kant, for those who are interested in the history of it, took that view. And so people broadly had the same consensus about what was right and what was wrong. But that, of course, we're all aware, is no longer universally held. If it was ever universally held, it's certainly no longer widely held by many. And in fact, many would label that as heteronormativity and would say that that is oppressive and damaging to people who don't fit neatly into those expectations. And the first wave, the first shift that came along was from the 1950s onwards with LGB rights. So the idea here was that, yes, there are two biological sexes, male and female, but gender identity is a social construct and doesn't really align with your biological identity. So let's separate that out as something socially constructed. And then actually when it comes to cross-dressing, well, what's really the problem with that? Who does it harm if that's what somebody wants to do? Because after all, that's all social constructs. So if your gender identity is a little bit different, or if part of who you are is a bit more for the opposite sex, then why not go with that? And when it comes to same-sex attraction, that for some people that is natural, and therefore it's okay to be attracted to whoever and to follow through on that. And broadly speaking, again, I think that line is broadly accepted in Western culture today. But that's not where things stop. The next shift is what we can call queer theory. And this really emerged in the academy, just as the whole thinking behind LGB arose in the academy from the 1950s. So if you look at the history, for example, of the use of the word gender, until the 1950s, gender meant the same thing as sex. There was no difference in how those words were used. In fact, gender was very seldom used outside linguistics, where it was used to describe different forms in languages that have different forms of words, of nouns, whether they're male, female, or sometimes neuter. But where it was used, it was basically the same thing. But in the 1950s, people began to distinguish those in the academy first, and then that grew and gained traction in society. But similarly, from the 1990s onwards, the big shift with queer theory was to say, well, biological sex, is that not also a social construct? Because after all, what happens is the baby is born, and based on a sort of arbitrary look at the external genitalia, a midwife or a doctor says, it's a boy, it's a girl. That's a label that is stuck on that person that defines their life in many ways for decades to come. And so the argument was, well, there isn't such a clear-cut distinction between the sexes. Perhaps there's a spectrum of difference. I'll not go into the detail of that, but this was literally, people came up with sort of measurements that said you can see these ranges of sizes of various things, and it's not so clear-cut, okay? And then, of course, gender identity, the thinking here now was more, well, why are we thinking still in terms of these two categories? If it's a social construct, who says that there are only two of these identities, and who constructed that? Is that not too limiting, too restrictive? Is it not truer to talk about a spectrum of identities, and in fact fluidity as well, and the idea that some people are somewhere between these two, or perhaps in another space altogether? So ideas like non-binary, or NB, which is just writing out the sounds of the letters N, B. E-N-B-Y. And then with gender expression, well, again, why should there be norms for two genders? Why not say anything goes, and really it's all fluid and a spectrum? And with sexual orientation, increasingly the argument was it's too simple to talk about people being attracted to one sex or the other. It's a spectrum, it's fluid, and in fact most people, the argument is, have some degree of attraction to both sexes. And some people have no attraction to either, and only a small number have fixed attraction to just one or the other. So this is what we can call queer theory, and that's the kind of thinking that is behind a lot of the tension. In fact, it's the tension between the purple line and the yellow line that we're seeing playing out in society at the moment. Because if you believe in the purple line, and you believe that the fight has been for rights to be married to somebody of the opposite sex, or to express your attraction to them physically without being judged, and somebody else comes along and says sex is just a social construct, you're removing the very categories that had such meaning for those people. Not to mention, of course, how some other groups are concerned, particularly feminist groups, about queer theory and what it means for women and for their rights. So, When it comes to this is a picture that you may be familiar with, the genderbread person, based on the gingerbread man, but the genderbread person. And it's trying to describe this clearly in child-friendly terms for use in education settings with perhaps primary-age children. And the idea here is that there are 4 labels on the body. They've put them in 4 different places. Expression around the outside, how you present yourself to the world, and that is more or less feminine or masculine, but it's really on a spectrum, and everyone is somewhere on those lines. And then identity in the brain, which is womanness or manness, but again, it's a spectrum and could be fluid. Attraction in the heart, I'll come back to that in a moment, and then biological sex, you can see where they've put that. But notice the attraction one at the bottom, they've separated this out further to say, well, there's romantic attraction and sexual attraction. In other words, the person that you like to go out for a date with and are romantically attracted to and like to have a deep and meaningful conversation with might not be the same person that you like to be sexually active with. Okay, so you might be romantically attracted to the same sex, but sexually attracted to the opposite sex. Why would those things have to align with each other as well? So this is the kind of messaging, and it really is queer theory put into pictorial form. And behind that, or with that, come certain messages. Explore diversity. Identity is inner. The real you is on the inside. It's not something you can see on the outside. There's a spectrum, this idea again of identities, fluidity of identities as well. Questioning labels. You might remember a prominent brand had advertising that said labels are for bottles. Okay, and that's exactly the idea behind it. And they used lots of images of people who didn't conform to typical gender stereotypes. And the idea was, well, drop the labels. Okay, forget about labels. Let's get rid of them altogether. And I would say that what this is really describing is a split self. In other words, underlying this is the assumption that there is no normal pattern for these diverse parts of you to align with. Now, I, as somebody who trained in medicine with the idea that there is such a thing as health, which is to do with integration and integrity, have a big concern about that, about this fundamental idea that we can be split into these different dimensions. But I think that's what we're seeing in this kind of argument. But let's step back from that a little bit, because I don't want to talk so much in this talk about what's happening in society. What I want to think more about is the underlying values, the underlying story. And I want to suggest that there are 5, you might add to that, or you might, reword some of them, but 5 big questions that we as human beings are looking for answers for. 5 big issues that we're trying to understand: meaning, identity, morality, purpose, and destiny. So I'll start in the middle. How should I live? It's an everyday question. What is a good life? What does life look like? That's a moral question. What is good as opposed to what is bad? But of course, how we answer that flows from who we understand ourselves to be. And who we understand ourselves to be rests on another question, but also, what should I do? The nitty-gritty detail of that is determined by what I think about the how question. So purpose flows from morality, and identity flows from a deeper question about why I am here in the first place. And of course, there's this question, where am I heading to in the end? So you've got a why, a who, a how, a what, and a where question. 5 big questions. And if you look at an example from popular culture, and this example is the Eurovision winner in 2024, Nemo, with the song The Code, and afterwards Nemo was calling on Switzerland, where Nemo is from, to recognize a third gender, because Nemo identifies as non-binary. But the song that Nemo sang gave answers to all of these 5 questions. So starting with the why. Let me taste the lows and highs. Let me feel that burning fright. This story is my truth. This is my poem. That's one of the opening lines in the song. But this story is my truth. So there's an answer there to the why question, which is actually saying there is no why before my existence. The why is something I construct in my experience, in my lived story. Who am I? Well, Nemo says, I went to hell and back to find myself on track. I broke the code, and the song is called The Code. And part of the idea there is that there was a code, that chart that we had earlier, which showed these 2 normal patterns. Well, that's a code that somebody has imposed. That code didn't fit for me. I didn't fit with it. And that was painful, going to hell and back, trying to struggle with not feeling that you fit within that. And of course, the message that's there is that the code was oppressive and repressive. And for Nemo to try and live by that code was repressive of Nemo. And then how are we going to get to a better place? Well, the question's asked in the song, who decides what's wrong, what's right? Everything is balance, everything's light. Okay, in other words, there is no absolute morality. The code that people put on is just constructed by them, presumably to suit the majority or the powerful or vested interests. But actually, morality is relative. And therefore, what am I going to do? Well, I'm done playing the game. I'll break out the chains. I'm going to be myself. In other words, self-discovery, authenticity, expression of self. And where is this going to lead to? Well, the song says, now I found paradise somewhere between the O's and ones. That's where I found my kingdom come. In other words, but you notice what that does? That limits again. If the why question begins with my existence here and now, well, the where question ends with the here and now, doesn't it? The best that we can do is to build a kingdom come, a paradise here now in our lived experience. There's nothing beyond that. There's no hope beyond that. And I think that song, in many ways, really captures a lot of the underlying thinking under queer theory and how that's working out in society. But I want to suggest from a Christian point of view, there is a false story that underlies that. And of course, that story begins with this answer to the why question. The ultimate why question before my existence is, we came from nowhere for nothing. So, if we believe the idea that we evolved through a meaningless process, this is not about the mechanism of evolution, but about the purposelessness of how that is believed to have happened. If that was meaningless and pointless, then life has no ultimate meaning. You have to construct your meaning based on your experience of it. And where are we going to? To nowhere. A hole in the ground or a crematorium, and that's it. So in other words, you only live once. So what are you going to do in the meantime, in between? Well, you're going to try and figure out how you are, and you could either accept the basic idea. The guy says on his t-shirt, I am a great ape. I think it is not a real gorilla that he's sitting beside. I hope not anyway. I don't know what happened next in this picture. But the point is, he's saying, I'm a great ape just like this guy. Right? So we could believe and accept that we are beasts, animals, which in many ways is what people used to believe when they followed nature, and they said, well, we are animals, but nature dictates things, biology dictates things, and biology seems to have these 2 forms, and those 2 forms work together in a certain way, so that's good enough for us. But if you look at the history of human thinking, you'll find that there's always a seesaw between a kind of view that reduces us to something animal-like, and then the kickback that comes when we realize actually we are more than the other animals around us. It's not really very hard to see that. Just go to any zoo and try and strike up a conversation with any of the things behind the bars. Might be hard enough with the people on your side of the bars, but actually there is a vast difference. And so in our lived experience, we have this sense that we are more than beasts. We are godlike in our ability to create meaning, to create purpose, to even advance our own existence. And I think one of the things that we're seeing with the growth of the influence of queer theory is a part of this pendulum swing away from the basic idea that we're just animals to an idea that we are more than that we can construct a better identity. We are not confined by our biology alone. And from a Christian point of view, that's quite interesting. Because if you're saying, I am in the wrong body, that raises all sorts of interesting questions about who is the I that is not just your body. That's not a statement that fits with the materialistic worldview that many people believed for a long time, where they said that we are just our bodies. But if there is an I who is not just my body, what is that I? The mind, the soul? And again, those interested in the history of philosophy can probably see lots of instances of this kind of tension. But what is it then that we're aiming for? Well, of course, happiness, and I think that picture kind of describes it, because you're trying to draw the picture of happiness, but there's a streak where the paint is running. But we're trying to construct a happy life, the kingdom come, my paradise now. And how am I going to do it? Well, I need to be free. I need to be free to choose. I need to have autonomy. So these are the big buzzwords: freedom, autonomy, freedom from the code that might restrict me from finding my happiness in this life before I die. And that works out, of course, in two different ways. But notice, freedom and autonomy are vitally important for both, because the traditional LGB campaigning, which you might think of the slogan that says "born this way," and there the argument is, this is my biology, this is what is natural for me. That's very much a kind of beast's argument. Yeah, this is natural for me, and if it's natural, what's wrong with it? But on the flip side, queer theory is more likely to say, my body, my choice. And in other words, people influenced by queer theory will say, I'm not born this way. I am a freely choosing individual, and it's okay for me to choose to be who I am. And that's why there's a fundamental tension. But both agree that they should be free. Either free to follow their biology, or free to follow their desires, their choices. Free choosing individuals. Now, of course, there are lots of questions we could ask about whether society and civilization can function on this basis, on the basis of this kind of tension, or even if it ends up settling on the upper side of this, how do you have a cohesive society if we are so driven by individualism? Because really what we're seeing culturally is what we could call, or what people have called, expressive individualism. It's a phrase that began with a man called Robert Bella, and others have written about it as well. But the idea that what our society is aiming for now is individualism, yes. I am my own person. But where it is different from the individualism of the past is that the I that I am must be expressed, must be shown to the world. And that works along these lines. The real me, first of all, is the inner me of my emotions, my desires, and my dreams. That is the truest thing about me. That is the most real thing about me. More real, truer than my body. And I must not repress the real me. I must express it in order to be happy. So we could say that means we think of ourselves as psychological selves. So it's a shift again away from biology to psychology, to saying we're going to put more weight on the mind, on thinking, on our inner sense of who we are, and that's the real me. And that is married then with implications for society. No one else can tell me who I am. To do so would be oppressive, whether that's a religious authority, doctors, educators, courts. Who else has the right to tell me who I am? And you, it's not just the authorities that exist, but you, each other individual, must affirm my expressed self, because if you don't, you're causing me harm. Okay? So in other words, it's not just enough in this way of thinking to say that don't interfere with my right to be me. You can't speak against it, you have to affirm it, because if you disagree with it, that in itself is harmful, because after all, the truest me is the me of my feelings and my thoughts. So if you hurt my feelings, you're hurting me, and that is an injury, a wound. And I think we can call this a therapeutic society. So the idea is that we are psychological selves, and society should be therapeutic for us, should be helping us feel better about ourselves and accept ourselves more. And two other things that have accelerated this: medical technology and communication technology. Medical technology, well, communication technology first, apparently. Okay, communication that spreads stories and ideas more rapidly than ever before. And with less debate and less checks and balances, so social media classically being the key one there. And for younger people, they are hugely susceptible to that and to the ideas and the stories that are so powerful within that. But that also monitors and controls dissent, or has the potential to do that. At least, even if it's just at the level of being unfriended or blocked or uninvited or whatever it might be. So the communication technology has made this accelerated. Whilst the kind of back and forward has been there in the history of human thinking, it's a much more rapid rate. Medical technology has enabled safe sex, meaning we can now stop people getting pregnant and control most of the nastiest sexually transmitted infections. So that took the brakes off a lot of the restraints on sexual activity. And medical technology has also advanced to a point surgically and with hormones and so on, where we can modify bodies to make the appearance of the opposite sex. And please notice that I say that because it isn't a true transition, but it's an appearance that a person may desire and that they may argue will help them to be truer to their inner true self. Now, what I do want to talk about is, well, what is God's story and how does that intersect with that story? And I'm going to start at the middle of God's story, the how question. Because from a Christian point of view, the very center of that, of course, has to be the person of the Lord Jesus Christ, crucified. God rescues us. So I want to begin from what Jesus said about these issues. And you might say, well, surely Jesus didn't say anything about these issues. But he did talk about male and female, and that's where I want to begin. So in Matthew 19, Jesus said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Well, therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." Now, why am I starting there? Because this is in relation to questions Jesus was being asked about marriage and divorce. So he's responding to specific questions. But notice what he does. He goes right back to the beginning, not the beginning of the individual story, but the beginning of the whole story, which he says is with creation and with the Creator, he who made them, with a God who made us male and female. So God's good design in creation. And when we look at that, we can look around us and realize that there are actually, counter to what the people who say sex is a social construct, that there are actually differences between male and female bodies. And those differences, some of them are quite obvious visibly. Okay, now there is a range of what is normal. Clearly, different sizes and shapes of male and female bodies. Part of the problem that we have, of course, is that society creates false images of what particularly the female body should be like. And that, of course, doesn't help anybody. But there are differences. And those differences on the surface level relate to the fact that there are two kinds of sex hormones, estrogens and androgens, testosterone. So there are two types of sex hormone, only two, okay, and not a third one. And that's because there are two kinds of sex organs that produce them, testes and ovaries, that produce those hormones. And those also produce different kinds of what we call gametes, sex cells, sperm, eggs, only two. Okay, notice again. And that's because there are two chromosomes, two types of sex chromosome, X's and Y's. And the typical female pattern is to have two X chromosomes. The Y chromosome, that always makes me laugh when you actually look at it, is actually just a tiny X, okay? So men like to say we've got something women don't have because we've got a Y chromosome, but actually we're missing something that women have because the Y chromosome is a lot smaller than the X chromosome. But it does have a particular gene called the SRY gene, which is what makes male physical development kick in. When that gene is active and activated, that makes the body develop along male lines. If that gene is inactive or absent because you don't have a Y chromosome, or because there's a problem with the gene, then the body will develop along female lines. Okay, so that's how this all starts. And that starts right at the very beginning of your unique individual existence, when the sperm, which is either carrying an X chromosome or a Y chromosome, meets with the egg, which is carrying an X chromosome, and you either get male or female. So it's not something that begins at birth. It's not a label that is put on. It's a biological reality. And of course, as with any biology, things can go wrong at any point along this. And so some bodies don't develop along those typical lines, although it's a very small percentage that actually really aren't easily assigned as either male or female. So whilst there are things that can go wrong, the vast majority of those cases, the body is either clearly male or female. Interestingly, at the other end of this also has implications for the typical, and notice I'm saying typical, male and female brain, because studies increasingly show that there tend to be different connections. So male brains often have more connections front to back, and female brains more connections side to side between the hemispheres. Now again, these are average studies. It's not saying there are male brains and female brains that we can neatly say, so that if you could scan your brain, we could say, well, you've got a female brain and a male body or whatever. It's not as simple as that, but on average, men and women tend to be different in these ways. And that also comes through very early on in life, because this brain difference is detectable in newborn babies. In other words, it's something that develops in the womb because of the different levels of hormone. And that explains why studies repeatedly show that when you give children a choice of toys, for example, more of the boys will choose cars, more of the girls will choose dolls. Okay, so there are kind of typical average differences between the sexes. But again, these are generalities with variation. So I'm not trying to say all girls must like dolls and all boys must like cars. Or if you're a boy and you don't like cars, there's something wrong with you. Or these are generalizations. But what we are saying is that there are two typical patterns, and that is very heavily influenced by biology, which is not just a social construct. So those studies that said it was, of course, they were looking only at the external genitalia. They weren't looking more deeply at the genes, for example. And this comes through in various studies. For example, all around the world, women are better empathizers than men, study finds. Okay, that might be a surprise to you. That might not. Okay, but it's just one of these findings that actually the more studies they do, and it cuts, notice they say right around the world, which is also a clue that tells you this is not just social, because things that are social won't be the same across all cultures. So back to God's story. So I'm just trying to say that I think what we're seeing in the biology fits with this idea that there are two fundamental patterns. And that goes right back to the beginning of the story, which says that God rules and that God created, and He created male and female, and He created them equal in relationship to Him, but different and complementary. And that is good and purposeful. That's not just an accident of blind evolution. That is part of God's good design. But Jesus went on, later on in the same chapter, so it's part of the same discussion, to talk about the end. He said there are those who choose to live like eunuchs, in other words, not to be sexually active, not to have children. That's what being a eunuch meant socially in those days, that you wouldn't have children. They do it for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And then he says later on in Matthew chapter 22, in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. In other words, Jesus is pointing not just back to creation, but forward to a new creation, the resurrection, he says, God's restoration of all things. And in that restoration, he says, marriage will not exist anymore the way it exists now. In other words, there is a greater fulfillment, a greater future that is in store. And the Bible explains that that is union with Christ, which means that marriage or sexual intimacy, whichever way you want to call that, is not the greatest thing that you can discover in this life, because it is only for this life, okay? And singleness, of course, that means is also only for this life, because whether married or single, those who are Christians are looking forward to something greater and better, which is full union with Christ and to become like Him. I don't think that means that male and female cease to exist, although we'll have to wait and see. But it certainly means marriage won't exist, and a lot of the differences, therefore, that come with that in this life won't exist. But it also means that whatever struggles we have in this life will not persist forever. There is a better future coming, the true kingdom coming. Okay? And so Jesus points to the past, He points to the future. But of course, Jesus also talks about the challenges of life in the world. So if you're thinking, well, that's all very nice to talk about this perfect creation and this perfect future, but how are we meant to live in this time when things aren't perfect? Well, Jesus acknowledged that too. He said there are eunuchs who were born that way. Things can go wrong with the development of the body. And there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, mutilated, in other words, as they used to do in the ancient world. Or we might think about people whose development sexually is harmed by the fact that they have been abused or mistreated. Jesus acknowledges that things in this world are not perfect. But He doesn't class these as a separate type of person. He doesn't create a third category for them, but He does acknowledge them and acknowledges them as precious people who are loved by Him and who matter. But elsewhere, again in Matthew, Jesus talks about a problem that we have with the heart and some of the evil things, including sexual sin, that come from the heart. So we do need to acknowledge that we live in a fallen world, that disorders of sex development are real and that needs compassion. But the term intersex, which is so widely used, is not, I think, a helpful term for that, because it's not a third identity. It's that there's something that hasn't developed as normal. But those who are not either clearly male or female, that's a very small percentage, as I've said. We do need to recognize the struggles in emotions and in thoughts, experiences of gender dysphoria, people who are deeply unhappy with a feeling that they are in the wrong body, and fixed same-sex attraction, that some people do experience attraction only for the same sex. We need to recognize the challenges in relationships, tensions between the sexes, which again, Scripture acknowledges right at the very beginning. Misunderstandings, conflicts, tendency to either manipulate or to control and oppress. We need to recognize problems with society, the lack of positive role models, distorted stereotypes of masculinity and of femininity, and we need to be live to that, how we construct visions of what it is to be male and female that aren't based either on biology or, from a Christian point of view, on Scripture, but simply on perhaps some bad behaviours or things that suit the majority or a typical man. For example, I do not like soccer, and at times I might have felt that's like a great social barrier for me as a man, but it doesn't make me less of a man, I think. Beliefs and ideologies, though. What we need to understand is that there are these issues and these challenges, but then there are false ideologies and values that endorse sin in all of these areas. And we could think about the wrong behaviours that Scripture describes as sinful, and that would be right and proper, and I think many of these are very live issues in our society. But what we need to understand is that the wrong things that people do flow from desires that are misguided. And as the Apostle Paul says, God gave people up to dishonourable passions. So there are dishonourable passions that lead to these wrong behaviours. But that to those who follow them, these wrong desires seem right because of the beliefs that they hold. So if you dominate the opposite sex or manipulate them, presumably there's a wrong belief that thinks that your sex is superior. If you don't think there should be any differences between the sexes in our expression or roles, that might be because of a wrong belief that gender is a social construct, or even the wrong belief that gender is I've said that gender is a social construct. I think that's a wrong belief, because gender is not purely socially constructed. Aspects of what's expected are social, but there's also a biological factor, and from a Christian point of view, there's a command of God factor that comes in as well. But underlying all of that, this idea that morality is relative, that feelings are truth, that I am free, my autonomy. And where does that come from? Well, the Apostle Paul in the verse just before the one at the top says, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. So the root problem is wrong worship. And why I think we need to be clear about this as Christians is that it won't do for us simply to stand with placards that say this or that behaviour is wrong, because all that sounds like to the person who thinks the code has been imposed by others is you just want to tie me up with your code that suits you. Whereas what I'm really saying is that I believe that there is a God who I worship and that He has designed things that are good in this way, and therefore He says these things are wrong. Okay? But that's several steps away from where they're at. So I need to be able to recognize that until the issue of wrong worship is solved, the wrong beliefs won't appear wrong. And until those beliefs are changed, then the desires won't seem wrong. And until the desires seem wrong, the behaviours won't seem wrong. Okay? So I'm not saying we can't talk about morality and right and wrong, but I think we need to go deeper to the question of what is it that a person is worshipping? Where is it that they are placing their trust? What is it that they are hoping in? Who is it that they are loving fundamentally? We rebelled. That's the fundamental issue that Jesus is describing with this problem that comes from the heart. That's the story of sin, that we are in rebellion against God. We have exchanged God for created things. And I suppose if you're going to worship created things, sooner or later, you'll end up worshipping the greatest created thing, which is yourself, human beings. But Jesus diagnosed this problem, the problem of the heart, but he also, like a good doctor, gave a treatment. And he called people to come to him. He said, "Come to me if you are burdened." I think that the burden of defining your own identity, of discovering who you are, of having to construct an identity and to build your happiness on that is an immense burden for anyone to carry. I can entirely understand why people would say, but it's better than being told who you are by other people who might oppress you, because there's been enough of that, hasn't there, in the history of the world, and there still is today. But what if there was somebody who truly knew what was truly good, what was who you truly were, better than you do yourself, and who had no intention for you other than good? Wouldn't that be somebody that you could trust in, listen to, who could take that load off you? And that's what Jesus says, "Come to me if you're burdened, and I will give you rest. I'll give you true rest. Learn from me." He doesn't just say, "Come to me and just I'll embrace you and it'll all be okay." He says, "Come to me and I'll teach you. I'll show you how to live. And you'll find rest for your soul." And then later on, again in Matthew, he says, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me." The turning point that Jesus is calling to us to is this. It's from autonomy, which I think is saying that I will put faith in myself, my judgments. I will hope in myself. I will love myself. And in fact, people are increasingly told to love yourself. But the call of Jesus is to say, instead of that, I have a Lord, and I will live by obedience, which means I'm placing my faith, my hope, and my love in Christ first. And I'm going to trust the fact that he loves me more than I trust my own love for myself. I'm going to trust in his hopes for me more than in my hopes for myself. I'm going to trust in his judgments about me more than in my own judgments. And I think as Christians, we need to be clear about this. And we need to be clear about it because this is not just about gender identity and sex. This is about every aspect of life, isn't it? And so whilst you might think, well, I don't struggle with those areas, there will be other things where I need to keep learning this truth. But I think in how we communicate to people, the clearer we can be about this, about saying that the reason I see this differently from you is not because I think, being a Christian and holding to this archaic code is suitable for me. There's a lot of stuff about being a Christian that is painful for me, that involves sacrifice. But I trust that Jesus, who is my Lord, knows better than I do. And therefore, when I talk about things like sin, I'm not talking about what suits me, I'm talking about what he says, because I'd rather talk to them about what he said than about what I think. So Jesus pointed us to God's true story. God rules, we rebelled, God rescues, we respond, God restores. A better beginning than the beginning of my story, a better ending than anything I can construct in this life, but that has Christ at the center, the crucified and risen Lord. So let me just say before I finish, and then hopefully we can still take some questions. We need to start where people are, but we need to be authentic. We do need to honor people as the precious, beloved creations of God that they are, in how we speak to them and how we speak about them. There is no room, and I hope there should never have been any room for mocking or crude joking or, making fun of people or bullying or any of those things. We must not do that. We honor this person. And you can honor somebody irrespective of what they believe and think. You don't have to agree with anything that they believe and think to honor them as a person. We do need to build compassionate, trusting relationships, but we do need to be authentic. And I think that means we should not affirm false ideologies. Now, these examples are questions, not saying this is what I think you should do, but it raises questions, doesn't it, about weddings, for example. Can I attend without affirming the ideology that I can't believe in? Or pronouns. If I use the pronouns that belong to the sex of the opposite sex from their biology, am I endorsing that ideology? And identity labels. And what I mean by that is I personally would not use the pronouns, just to answer that one, but I will use a name. The reason being that names are socially constructed and have all sorts of reference points to all sorts of people that I might not admire. But just because somebody's named after that prophet or that historic figure or that pop star doesn't mean I won't use that name. So I'll use a name, but a pronoun belongs to everyone rather than to an individual. So I think that I wouldn't be comfortable with. But when it comes to identity labels, my view is that the idea that your identity is defined by sexual attraction or your understanding of who your inner self is, I think is a lie. I think is a falsehood. And therefore I would even say I've in my cheekier moments or more consistent moments, I won't tick a box that says I'm heterosexual, even though I'm married and don't experience same-sex attraction, because that's a meaningless category. I am not defined by my sexual desires. I am a married man, that defines who I am, and I should be faithful to my wife, okay? Being heterosexual doesn't mean it's okay for me to have desires for all sorts of other women who aren't my wife, right? So, yeah, I'm not saying you have to follow that, but I do think it's worth thinking about that. This idea of these categories in itself might be wrong. Those labels perhaps are unhelpful. But seek understanding, listen to people without prejudging or assuming. Particularly if they do use a label. One of the good things about the idea that labels are for bottles is you get to say, well, look, I just don't know what that means. Don't pretend that you do. Don't think, well, I went to a seminar once or I read it in a book or on a website, because what they mean by it might be different than what somebody else means. So ask them. When you say that, what does that mean? Tell me about your experience. Tell me what that feels like. Tell me what you experience. Don't prejudge. Don't make assumptions. And make a distinction between distress and struggles and wrong beliefs and wrong behaviors. In other words, if somebody says, I am ... it's quite a different thing if they're saying, I feel that way, but I haven't done anything about it. Or I feel that way and I have done this. Or I feel that way and I'm convinced that that's who I am and that is absolutely right. Those are different things. So listen and understand. Share God's true story. Center on Christ. Try and bring it to Him and on who He is and how His life was a fulfilled life, despite all of the limitations of being single, not sexually active, not having children, and dying at a young age in a horrific way. But how can that life have been so fulfilled? And it's because He believed in the story that He shared with others. That was His story that He lived in. So center on Him and His call to repent and explain, above all, I have a Lord. For me, this is not an issue of what suits me. I'm not here to judge you, but I do want to tell you that I believe in Jesus and I trust what He says about this. And I've found that when I do that, that's never let me down. And I believe there's good reason to trust in Him and believe in Him. I believe that's good for everyone, but go and check Him out for yourself. Be honest too about faith's struggles and wrong desires. I don't think we commend the gospel to other people if we pretend that we sail along through life and being a Christian is just easy all the time and we have no struggles and no problems. So as we build friendships, it's okay to say, I might not struggle with this thing, but I struggle with this. And here's how I work through that as a Christian when I realize that God's view on that is different than what might suit me. And we need to show a plausible alternative. And that means we do need to know how to build intimate, non-sexual relationships, how to support one another to live by God's design, to encourage each other along the way, to be friends to one another, to not make single people feel like they're missing out on the greatest thing in life, or to make married people feel like their marriage has to be like heaven on earth, okay? Because that's not the reality. We're all longing for something even better to come. and learning authentic masculinity and femininity as Scripture describes. So what I mean by that is that there is a lot in Scripture that talks about what it is to be male and female and what that means in terms of difference. And we can't just discard that, but we do need to look carefully at that and to bring that together with perhaps what we know from biology and what seems to be true across those average differences, and then to learn how those different strengths complement each other for good, so that it's good to be female or it's good to be male, and I don't have to pretend not to be, but it's also okay that there are different types of men and different types of women. So we do need to learn authentic masculinity, authentic femininity, to ditch some of the social stereotypes, to ditch some of the stereotypes that are not based either in Scripture or in clear biological things. And I think we can go a long way in doing that. Just some thoughts about how we might communicate about this and how we might live within God's big story. So, Garling, you can stop that. That was definitely longer than I intended it to be, and time is beyond us, but I presume because we